On the afternoon of August the 15th, 1945, hours after the Emperor of Japan announced on the radio that the war was over, a Japanese vice admiral sat in his diary and wrote that it was not. He wrote that the spirit of Japan had not surrendered. He wrote that he would prove it. And then, within hours, he climbed into a dive bomber on a Kyushu airfield, told his staff he was going to ram an American ship off Okinawa, and took off. The war ended at noon. He took off at 6 in the evening. These two facts cannot both be true in the same world, and the tension between them is exactly what this episode is about. Not a man who missed the announcement, not a man who was cut off in some remote posting without communications. A man who heard the Emperor speak, understood what it meant, and decided that it did not apply to him. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki was not a fringe figure. He was not some isolated commander at the edge of the empire's collapse. He was one of the most senior officers in the Japanese Navy, a man who had sat physically beside Isoroku Yamamoto for years as his chief of staff, reading the same intelligence, studying the same maps, shaping the same strategy. He understood the Pacific War as well as anyone alive in Japan on August the 15th, 1945. And he kept a diary, meticulous, daily, personal, that survived him and was published after the war under the title Fading Victory. It is one of the most revealing documents produced by any Japanese officer of the war, because it does not speak in the official language of the military or the coded silence of the court. It speaks in Ugaki's own voice, as he actually thought. And what it reveals in the final entries is a man at war with a situation he had not been given any framework for surviving. To understand what drove Ugaki off that airfield at 6 o'clock on the last evening of the war, you need to understand two things about who he was. The first is that he had already survived something he felt he had no right to survive. On the 18th of April, 1943, American P-38 fighters, guided by decoded Japanese radio intercepts, ambushed a flight of aircraft over Bougainville Island in the Solomon Islands. In one of those aircraft was Yamamoto, then Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the most important naval officer in Japan. His aircraft went down in the jungle. There were no survivors. In a second aircraft, flying in formation, was Ugaki. His plane was also shot down. He was the only person pulled alive from the sea. Yamamoto was dead. Ugaki had survived the same attack. He would carry that arithmetic for the rest of the war.
The second thing to understand is where Ugaki was in August of 1945. He commanded the 5th Air Fleet, based at Kanoya Air Base on the island of Kyushu. His command had been, for months, the primary instrument of the organized Kamikaze campaign, the program of deliberate, manned, one-way attacks against Allied naval vessels. He had sent hundreds of young men to their deaths in this way. He had watched the program from above, recording the sorties and the results in his diary with the precise, dispassionate attention of a man keeping accounts he knows will eventually be examined. He had seen what the attacks could do, and he had seen the numbers of what they could not do. The Allied fleet had not broken. The home islands were closer to invasion every week. And the diary in those final weeks records a man watching something he had devoted years to building slowly reveal that it was not enough. He knew the arithmetic. He had run it himself. It simply did not change his conclusion about what was required of him.
The ambush of April 18, 1943 is a detail that the historical record skips past quickly, but it is the load-bearing event of Ugaki's final act. To understand why, you have to think about what survival meant inside the culture Ugaki belonged to. The Japanese military code, Bushido,
as it was practiced and taught in the officer corps, did not have a comfortable category for surviving when your commander did not. The correct response to such a death, within the logic of that code, was not to be grateful for the sea that held you up. It was to feel, permanently, that the accounting was wrong, that you owed a debt to the dead that you had not yet paid, and that the only currency that would settle it was your own death in the same service. Ugaki spent 2 more years as a senior admiral, running one of the war's most lethal campaigns, and the debt did not diminish. If anything, it grew. The diary entries from 1943 onward carry the quality of a man writing under a particular kind of moral pressure. Ugaki was meticulous, disciplined, and capable of the kind of analytical clarity that made him Yamamoto's choice for chief of staff. But the entries also carry, underneath the operational precision, a persistent note that might be called survivor's accounting, a running calculation of what was still owed. When the 5th Air Fleet's pilots launched their final missions, Ugaki wrote about them with a respect that was more than official. These were men doing what he believed he had not yet done. They were paying in full. He was still keeping the books. The diary does not say this directly, because men like Ugaki did not say such things directly, but it is present in every line that records a pilot's name alongside a departure time and a target, and the notation that they did not return.
By the summer of 1945, the situation Ugaki commanded was deteriorating in ways that the diary tracks with clinical accuracy. The aircraft available for missions was falling. The quality of the training that the new pilots received had collapsed under the pressure of losses. Some men flew their only mission within weeks of first sitting in a cockpit. The Allied anti-aircraft systems had adapted and improved. The loss rate on attacks was climbing. And behind all of this was the larger strategic picture that Ugaki could read as well as anyone. The home islands were being bombed into ruin from the air. The navy that had once been the pride of the empire was functionally gone. And the army's plan for the defense of Kyushu, the landing that everyone knew was coming, was built on the assumption of national annihilation as a price worth paying. Ugaki wrote all of this down. He was not deceived about the situation. He simply drew a different conclusion from it than surrender.
What Ugaki drew from the deteriorating situation was not despair in the ordinary sense. The diary in those months has the quality of a man narrowing his field of vision by choice, moving toward a single point with the deliberate focus of someone who has already made his essential decision and was now simply waiting for the moment when he can act on it. He organized his command with the efficiency that had always defined him. He sent his pilots. He wrote their departures down. And the diary, beneath all of this, carries an undertone that becomes unmistakable in retrospect. He was waiting to go himself. He had been waiting since April of 1943. The 5th Air Fleet's operations were the context, but they were not the conclusion. The conclusion was something he intended to reach personally, when the moment was right, or when it was, at last, unavoidable.
At noon on August the 15th, 1945, the Japanese people heard the voice of their emperor for the first time. The Gyokuon Hoso, the Jewel voice broadcast, was delivered from a phonograph recording made the night before. The language was formal and archaic, difficult for ordinary listeners to parse completely. It did not use the word surrender. It said that the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and that Japan would have to bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable. But its meaning was not actually obscure. Across the country, in homes and on street corners, and in factories and on military bases, people understood what they had heard. For most of them, it was the end of a certainty they had held for years. The certainty that the war would continue, that it had to continue, that there was no other version of the story. At Kanoya Air Base on Kyushu, Vice Admiral Ugaki listened to the broadcast with his staff. He heard it clearly. He understood it. And then he decided what to do about it.
What Ugaki decided was recorded in his diary on that day, in entries that are among the most studied in any Japanese memoir of the war. He wrote that he could not accept the situation as final. He wrote that the spirit of Japan, the spirit that the Kamikaze campaign had been expressing, could not simply be switched off by an announcement from the radio. He wrote that he had a duty to the men he had sent out before him, to the pilots who had already gone, and to Yamamoto, whose death he had survived without repaying. The diary on that afternoon is the document of a man completing an argument with himself that had been going on for 2 years and arriving, now, at the only conclusion he had ever really been moving toward. It is not the writing of someone who lost his reason. It is the writing of someone who believed, with complete clarity, in a set of values that led him to a place the rest of his world had just decided to leave behind.
At around 6 o'clock in the evening of August the 15th, Ugaki assembled his staff and announced that he intended to lead a final attack against Allied vessels near Okinawa. The announcement was not framed as an order in the usual military sense. It was framed as something closer to a personal declaration, an act that he was undertaking in his own name, in the name of the men who had gone before, and in the name of what he believed the war had meant. Before he boarded the aircraft, he removed the rank insignia from his uniform. This was a gesture with a specific meaning in the culture he inhabited. He was not dying as a vice admiral, a title, an office, an institutional role. He was dying as a warrior. He held a short glass of sake. His diary's last entry, written that afternoon, stated that he was going to proceed to the waters off Okinawa, where so many of his men had lost their lives, and ram into the arrogant American ships, displaying the real spirit of a Japanese warrior. The question of who else went with him has never been settled with complete clarity, and the uncertainty is itself significant. Accounts of August 15th at Kanoya describe a scene in which a number of aircrew, some accounts say as many as 22 men across 11 aircraft, prepared to join Ugaki's departure. Some of these men appear to have volunteered. Others, by some accounts, did not. The precise line between an order and an expectation in a military culture that had spent years teaching its members that death in service was the highest honor is not easy to draw from the outside. But the question matters because it is the point at which Ugaki's act, which from his perspective was deeply personal and entirely self-directed, becomes something that reached beyond him, that pulled others into a decision he had made for himself.
11 aircraft took off from Kanoya in the early evening of August 15, 1945. They flew southwest toward the waters off Okinawa, where the greatest naval concentration of the Allied war effort had gathered over the preceding months. Ugaki's aircraft was a Yokosuka D-4Y Susei, a fast, single-engine carrier dive bomber that the Navy had used throughout the war's later campaigns. The Susei was the aircraft most associated with the kind of mission Ugaki was flying. He was not in an unfamiliar aircraft. He was in the aircraft of his command's purpose, the instrument of the campaign he had directed for months, and he had placed himself in the seat his pilots had occupied on every departure he had ever recorded in his diary.
At some point during the flight, Ugaki's radio operator transmitted a final message. It stated that Ugaki and his aircraft were diving on an enemy ship. It was the kind of message that would have been filed alongside hundreds of others in the war's records. A final transmission from a dive that did not return. But this one was different, because the war was over. The official ceasefire had been announced. The Allied naval vessels in the waters near Okinawa were no longer in a war footing in the same sense as the day before. And the final transmission
when investigators looked at the American records afterward, found no corresponding event. No ship reported being struck, no ship reported being attacked. No impact, no explosion, no damage. The message was transmitted. The aircraft flew into the evening sky. And then, there was nothing more.
Ugaki's body was never found. The crash site was never confirmed. Some fragments of aircraft were located on a small island in the area where the final transmission placed him, but the evidence was never definitive enough to close the record with certainty. This ambiguity is, in retrospect, fitting, because the entire act had always been about something that could not be confirmed by physical evidence. Ugaki was not trying to sink a ship. He had enough experience to know that 11 aircraft on a ceasefire day against a Navy that was no longer expecting attack were not going to alter the strategic situation in any way that mattered. What he was doing was something the physical world could not register on his behalf. He was completing an argument. He was settling an account.
The silence that followed the final transmission is one of the defining silences of the Pacific War's ending. Not the silence of the Gyokuwan Hoso broadcast. That silence, the one that fell across Japan at noon when the emperor finished speaking, was a shared silence, a national silence, the silence of a people receiving a shock together. The silence after Ugaki's transmission was different. It was the silence of an act that had no audience, no confirmation, no response from the world it was directed at. The ships it targeted, if they were targeted at all, did not know they had been. The war that had produced the act had already ended. The diary that might have recorded the moment was closed. 11 aircraft flew into the evening, and the Pacific received them the way it had received so many others, with no record, no acknowledgement, no accounting. The sea has no memory for the gestures made above it.
Ugaki was not the only senior Japanese officer who chose death on August 15, 1945. That same day, the same hours, Army Minister Korichika Anami committed seppuku in his home in Tokyo. Anami had been one of the most powerful men in Japan, the head of the army, a figure who had stood at the center of the cabinet debates over whether to accept the surrender terms. He had, in the end, signed the document that accepted them. And then he had gone home and died by his own hand. He left a short note. It said, in effect, that he apologized to the emperor for his great crimes. These two acts, Ugaki's flight and Anami's seppuku, happened on the same afternoon, carried by the same cultural logic, and produced two completely different kinds of endings. Anami's death was private, ordered, contained within his own home, a withdrawal from the world on the world's terms. Ugaki's was directed outward, at an enemy that was no longer at war, an attempt to carry the fight into a space where no fight remained.
What Ugaki's act said about Bushido, about the code of the warrior that the Japanese military had spent decades teaching and refining, is something that Japan has not stopped discussing since August of 1945. Within the framework of that code, as it was actually taught and practiced, his departure was not madness. It was the most coherent possible expression of what the code required. A warrior did not outlive the defeat of his cause. A warrior who had sent hundreds of others to die had an obligation to go himself. A warrior who had survived Yamamoto's death had a debt that the code recognized as unpayable by any currency except the same one. Ugaki was doing, in his own evaluation, exactly what the code required. The problem, the thing that Japan has been working through in the decades since, is what it means to have built an entire military and national culture around a code whose final, complete expression is a dive bomber flying into an empty ocean at 6 o'clock on the first evening of peace.
The post-war reckoning with men like Ugaki, and with the institutions that produced them, was complicated by the fact that the values they embodied
were not simply military values. They were national values, taught in schools, embedded in literature, expressed in every formal ceremony of Japanese public life for a generation. The men who could not stop, who could not hear the broadcast and accept it as their own story's ending, were not aberrations. They were, in a precise and uncomfortable sense, the most complete products of everything the system had designed them to be. The officers who accepted the surrender were doing something that required them to work against their deepest training. The ones who could not were following it to its conclusion. Understanding this does not make Ugaki's act defensible in the usual sense, but it makes it comprehensible in a way that changes what questions you think to ask, not only about him, but about every institution that teaches loyalty without limits and then discovers, at the end, what loyalty without limits actually requires of the people who believed it.
Ugaki's diary, Fading Victory, was recovered after the war and published, and it stands as one of the most precise records of what the Pacific War looked like from inside the Japanese Naval Command. It records everything: the strategy sessions and the weather and the pilots' names and the departure times and the entries that have no return times beside them. The final entry, from August the 15th, is the last voice of a man who had spent 2 years finishing a sentence he started when he was pulled out of the sea at Bougainville. Whether the sentence was finished in the way he intended, whether it accomplished anything he would have recognized as completion, is not something the record can answer. The aircraft flew, the radio went silent, the ocean closed. And the war that had already ended produced in its last hours one more act that no one had ordered and no one could stop, because the man who launched it had decided long before that evening that there was only one person whose permission he required, and he had given it to himself. Next on Tora Files, the surrender was signed, the occupation had begun, but Japan still had one more secret to give up. Tora Files tells the untold history of the Pacific War from the Japanese side, one episode at a time. Subscribe to see the next chapter.